And I want to thank PineBridge, of course, for sponsoring this event, also bringing in such a diverse group of people for this panel. I have to say, I haven't really done one of these where we have people that come from so many different backgrounds. So I think it's going to be pretty interesting. We're going to talk more about this dispersion theme, of course, which has been really big this year. And the disruption doesn't go just far beyond economics or markets, as we've been talking about already, but also when it comes to politics, which has been such a theme this year, technology, environment, as well as the consumer. So we're going to try to explore all that as well, and feel free if you have any kind of questions. We're going to bring it out to you guys at the end of the panel discussion here today. But I just want to start off with a very general question for my panelists here today. But let me just introduce everybody first. Next to me is Kevin Wong. He is the co-founder of Orgami Labs. He's going to be focusing more on the disruption in technology, and he's going to do a bit of a demonstration for us a little bit later on. Sunny Ng, which is from PineBridge Investments, portfolio manager for global multi-asset. Michelle is joining us from Rooftop Republic, the co-founder there. Very interesting stuff of what she's doing in Hong Kong when it comes to urban farming. As well as Professor Richard Hu, joining us here to talk a little bit more about the politics. He joins us from the Hong Kong University, the head of the departments of politics, to talk a little bit more about the dispersion we've seen, particularly when it comes to this trade war. And as well as I want to introduce Pascal Martin there joining us to talk more about the consumer side of things. So first off, I'll start with you, Kevin. What do you think is the biggest dispersion that you've seen this year?
It's been highlighted a little bit, but...
Make sure to turn your mics on, too. Sorry about that.
It's been highlighted a little bit, but I think it's sort of reaching critical mass for artificial intelligence, especially in the last year. You've seen it affecting many different industries in a very practical and grounded way. I think in the last 5 years, it's really been a lot of hype, not a lot of understanding of what artificial intelligence was actually capable of. But you're starting to see a lot of both consumer-facing and a lot of sort of B2B use cases of artificial intelligence. I think that's going to only grow from this point on, and we're definitely at the inflection point.
Michelle, I'll have you go.
So, when I think about today's topic about divide, I think it brings me back to always this subject matter that I'm very passionate about, which is food. So as many of you might be aware, there's a lot of developments in the area of research into like climate change. And obviously there's a lot of changes that we all have to make as a society in order to avoid this, disaster that's coming, upon us. But I think one of the very key areas that we see is in the area of food, in terms of food security, in terms of how we think, how we consume, and how we dispose of, of food. So I think this is the big disruption that I see that's already taking place. That's in the area of food, and as well as the way we grow it. Yeah.
Professor?
Yes, I speak from the perspective of politics. I think there are several things we have to pay attention to this year. There's a lot of natural disasters. There's a regional crisis. There's Brexit, a new development. But if I were asked to pick several things on the political side, I would pick first. From the beginning of this year, we see sharp rise of geopolitical tensions among the major powers. Remember in the early this year, U.S. have published national security strategy and also U.S. national defense strategy and several other reports. So Russia, China was officially named as strategic rival of the United States. So this is, I think, start a new game in world politics. And the second thing, of course, we all know that the current ongoing U.S.-China trade war, and the Trump administration began to hammer China very hard on a lot of issues. So we see a new type of trade war between the two powers. So this is still ongoing, and whether there will two leaders meet at the end of this month and the G20 meeting, whether they will get a deal done or not, I'm not quite sure, but we can talk about that later. The third things I would say about the politics is, U.S. midterm election we just saw 2 weeks ago, and it in some way have changed U.S. political atmosphere, or the rebalance a little bit about, in the congressional balance of power. So that will have some impact on the U.S. Domestic politics in the next 2 years.
Well, if I if I look at it from a consumer perspective, I think that the two big things that I see shaping how things are going to evolve in the next few years is one is, of course, technology. We've talked about it a little bit. You would say, what does a guy with gray hair like me know about technologies? I have 2 teenagers at home, and I see the way they consume, the way they buy learning. Yesterday I was going home and my son was looking at a lecture on the internet on his iPhone, and I was asking him, it was a lecture in math. So I asked him, what the hell are you doing looking at a lecture in math? Well, he told me, my teacher at school is not that good. And here I have somebody who is probably world-class in math, and I prefer to look at his lecture, and then I do my exercise with my prof. So, as Mr. Tsang was saying, I think we're going to see some real big changes, disruption in the world of education. Of course, in the world of retail, I was going to cite what Jack Ma said in his letter to his shareholders about a year ago, where he said, we're seeing retail change in front of our eyes. And, there's a lot of communication and hype around new retail. We at OC&C have done some research into it. And, it's a pretty remarkable new approach to retail. And I think when you look at how different generations shop, there's a huge gap, even between the young millennials and the old millennials. And when you look at how the Gen Z are shopping, what we have seen until now is just the beginning of something very, very profound. The other big trend I see, and you mentioned about it, is the consciousness about the environment. And again, I like to use the reference to my kids. Their consciousness about their environment and the world that we have left to them with all the plastic pollution, with all the CO2 problem, their level of consciousness about these issues is way higher than, me at their same age. Now I'm becoming conscious because I am being influenced by them, which, by the way, is a big trend. Gen Z influencing older people. So I think that, I would summarize technology, environment, and how the younger generations are now going to influence more and more the older people.
So Sunny, how does that work in your world then, when you have so many disruptions in so many facets of life now?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't make life easy for an investment manager, but it's really all of the above. So if you think about what the comments have been so far, everything has been reflected in the market. So the dispersion in all of these dynamics are being reflected in the market. So if you look at the dispersion between the tech sector and the old economy, that's very clear that this year that was a huge theme. If you look at geopolitics, obviously that was a massive driver of markets themselves. The U.S. versus everyone else essentially was this year's economic kind of dispersion that you saw. The one question that is on our minds at the moment is these interlinkages create potential risk. And the one that I think is less talked about is the regulatory risk and the potential for all of these themes to converge into a regulatory backlash against technology in particular. Because if you think about the parallels between the tech sector and what's happening there and the financial sector post-2008, you can clearly see a lot of parallels there. So the headline today on the New York Times front page headline was about Facebook, and it was delay, deny, and defer, something like that about that. I mean, that sounds very clear from a populism standpoint. That sounds like what you would have heard about banks not so long ago. Don't forget, the same people that are rushing into technology at the moment, the same talent, were the talent that rushed into banking not so long ago as well. So there's not really a problem with the people themselves. This is not about demonizing a tech person or a finance person, but this is more a sector that is largely, regulation is way behind the curve, firstly. They're not fully caught up with the most recent technology. And the reaction post, what John was talking about the disruption of jobs, is clearly going to lead to political pressure that will clearly lead to regulatory pressure. And I think that is going to come sooner rather than later, and that's going to have a massive disruptive impact on everyone here, essentially, and markets themselves.
Maybe I'll get Kevin to kind of talk about that regulatory risk in technology. Is that something that worries you as an entrepreneur?
Not particularly. I mean, I think it's great for us, and it's a boom for us, right? We're sort of definitely in the middle of a gold rush. Here in Hong Kong, here in Asia, I think a lot of economies are in fluctuation. And so especially here in Hong Kong, we're trying to find that third wave, from manufacturing to finance to whatever the next wave is. And so, I mean, the way I see it is, in the short term, there will be a lot of disruption in jobs. For example, I mean, to be frank, I think a lot of artificial intelligence is better than humans at doing a lot of things. It's just more efficient and lower cost. So eventually, it will take over certain jobs. But it's also not the first time that we've gone through automation. It's happened several times in human history. And so really, I think the talent ends up just shifting to other places. And we end up becoming, in our industry, we call it the convergence. Humans end up becoming more creative, and we start shifting towards other industries. So eventually, we'll all find jobs. It's just the nature of our jobs will start to shift.
I hope that AI anger doesn't catch on. Just want to say they can't do panels like this, just saying. What does that fit into your world then, Professor Hu? Because we've seen these pockets of populism that is really disrupting how we think. It's disrupting how markets are perceiving what's to come. How is it affecting the global power balance that you see around the world right now? Is it going to be really about the US and China that are going to continue this trade war, not just about trade deficits, but more about a potential Cold War that is emerging now?
Yeah, if it's just about rebalancing the trade, it will be much easier to solve between U.S. and China. The difficulty is more than that. People do not know what is the bottom line of Trump administration, what is really demand from China. And so we are seeing a game, Trump administration shooting at a moving target. Today he asked for this, and the next day he may ask for another things. So this is a quite wide range of things. People do not know where Trump really want. It is between balancing trade and containing China geopolitically. So in the forthcoming summit between the two leaders, I think they may find a temporary solution. So maybe call for a pause of current trade war. And, U.S. probably will withhold some of the sanctions and then ask some concession from China. But I don't think China have a lot of room to concede on this industrial policy, subsidies, and other things. So because if China concedes too much, it's really hurt Xi Jinping's domestic political legitimacy. That's something I'm pretty sure Xi Jinping will not yield. And so now we're at a crossroad. Are we going to move toward play the hard geopolitical game, or just rebalancing the trade, or find a middle road, find a middle way we compromise? But my hunch is even the two leaders will have a deal at the end of this G20 meeting. It will be probably will work for a while, just maybe the beginning of the bigger troubles. And the next year, and even 2020. 2020 is a U.S. election year. These things will come back again.
If I may, Professor, I think the U.S. has much more to lose than China in this game. When you look at the growth that the two countries are having, very soon China is going to be ahead. And when you look at who is going to suffer from the trade war, I think as it was, the remark was made before, the American consumer is going to have to suffer much more. And in fact, the Chinese economy is now largely led by local consumption, which is now more than 70% of the total growth. And I think that, the US can play around, but at the end of the day, there's such a power from the growing Chinese economy and the scale of it that I think in this game, Trump thinks that he has the higher hand, but at the end of the day, I think China is really in a much stronger position to negotiate.
Yes, I agree with you, but this game is not about who lose more than others. It is about who can hold on longer, who can really, in the end, eventually get their way, through. So I think on that front, I think it is really about the political will. If we come to the political will, I think probably China, because political system there, will last longer. Because U.S. A lot of people bet Trump will just another 2 more years, and maybe, or if he gets reelected, another 6 years. So,
Michelle, jump in here and talk a little bit more about, you mentioned that there are themes in what you do that kind of connects with what we're seeing geopolitically, whereas this rise in populism is Trump is not exactly the cause of it, but a symptom of it, of what we've been seeing on the ground, which is the haves versus the have-nots. How does that translate into the urban farming type of world?
So just to also give a bit of a background, so what we are trying to do with urban farming is not just about growing your own food, but also having that consciousness that Pascal mentioned about your decisions when it comes to eating, because that's something you engage with at least 3 times a day. Sorry. And so I think after hearing from Professor Hu and Pascal, I think against the whole backdrop of the political tensions, I do see, and I know that a lot of the impact that arises from that, is going to hit us, in varying degrees. But at the same time, in terms of supporting small community farmers, there is a huge resurgence of, sort of small businesses, independent producers that may not be able to overcome, the power, of, the big corporations, but yet with a greater consciousness from the consumers, they are able to have a voice. They will be able to have a shot, at surviving this world where, it's very much dominated by the global food supply and people with the means. But simply by supporting these small businesses, the small farmers who are actually in their processes of growing our food, they are making huge impacts to mitigating the damage on our environment. So I think that is something that we see and we are supporting, and we hope that we are able to bring to the awareness of more people. Yeah.
And Sunny, I guess when I bring it back to markets, the trend has just been shifting. We went from synchronized growth back in 2017. Now we're talking about it's the U.S. against the rest of the world, even when it comes to the financial markets and how much the U.S. has outperformed, especially the likes of China. What will 2019 bring for us? Is it more about further dispersion, or do you see more convergence?
So I think there would be a case to be made that there's likely to be more convergence than divergence next year, just because of where we stand today in terms of the massive divergence we've seen. So it's very difficult for the U.S. to continue to outperform to this level, and most likely there will be some kind of convergence, either the U.S. coming down towards the rest of the world or the rest of the world coming up. That's still questionable. As I listen to the different comments, it's interesting because increasingly it's not really our job anymore to predict what happens with political outcomes. So people often ask us, what's going to happen with the trade war.
Is it priced in?
Is it priced in? What's happening there? And I think increasingly it's about understanding the implications of, firstly, what's already been announced, what implication that has on cash flows, what implication that has on earnings. So, for example, for us, we're less focused at the moment. Of course, we understand the downside risk of the outcome of the trade war, but what are the impacts already? And if you look at that, what you'll notice is that so far this year, exports have done really well, as you know, in China. And that has been primarily because people have been front-loading their orders before tariffs actually get through. And so what that means is that we're setting ourselves up for a period of inventory destocking, meaning that growth is probably going to get a little bit worse before it actually gets better, even if stimulus does come. So these are the kind of things that, while it's better for us to focus on where we have an understanding of, rather than to place bets on, what's going to be the outcome of the summit that's coming up.
And Pascal, I mean, you track the consumer. How have spending habits changed? I mean, there's been some concerns about, are we entering into kind of a cyclical slowdown in China at the moment, where it seems like their spending habits have changed from what we saw. It's not so much the big ticket items anymore that they're spending on.
Well, certainly when you look at consumer confidence index in most countries in the last 6 months, you can see this confidence going down a little bit in Asia, in Europe. Interestingly enough, it's still up and pretty stable in the US, but for how long? And so definitely all these trade war discussions, all these issues are having an impact on people's perception about the stability of their future. And so it has maybe in the short term a little bit of impact on how much they consume. Now, I was discussing recently with some journalists about what happened during Singles Day, and they absolutely wanted to find signs of slowdown in Singles Day. And at the end of the day, it was still plus 27%. On the Alibaba-related sites. At the same time, JD also ran a very successful event. They sold more than $25 billion in the 11 days running to 11/11, and so it's a super double-digit growth that we're talking about. Now, what's interesting is to see in the mix of products that were sold. For example, there was a little bit less of white goods. And so this is a reflection that people are buying less to equip their house, which means, and it's quite correlated to the general feeling about how housing is evolving in China. Now, on the other hand, they've been massively buying cosmetics, consumer goods, and so on. And what you see also is that there is a proliferation of events like Singles Day during the whole calendar now. And so people have more choices of events during which they can buy. So I don't see any sign of slowdown, personally, in the Singles Day that we have just experienced. And when you look at the fundamentals, which is the number of people that are coming into the middle income groups in China every year, this is still continuing to increase. Their disposable income is still continuing to increase. And when you look at the shopping behavior of younger generations, they have quite a solid propensity to spend. We did a survey recently in the luxury sector to look at online shoppers. And what we found remarkable that Generation Z online shoppers of luxury goods, fashion and accessory, among them was the biggest group of people who spent more than 50,000 RMB per year. And that was more than the millennials, more than the Gen X. So when these people, of course, they are protected today because they live with their parents, they don't have to pay rent, they don't have to pay for education and so on. When they become, heads of households, are they going to continue to spend like that? And we think that there are signs that they will, to some extent, continue to do that. Because maybe they will spend less than on housing, less on cars than their parents. Why? Because the sharing economy is becoming more and more important. And if they spend less on these big ticket items, they will spend more in traveling, in experiences, and in buying nice things for themselves, including luxury goods and premium goods that they really like.
Kevin, I guess we can talk a little about how these changing spending habits, we have market volatility. I mean, how is that impacting a startup like yourself that is looking for fundraising as well? I mean, does this U.S.-China trade war impact the fundraising and where the trend and money goes?
It does, and I think it's funny because in reality, I think the tech world is actually affecting the geopolitical environment a lot more than a lot of us realize. In the sense that, you know, today the way we digest information is through social media, through Facebook, through Instagram, or whatever you use. But actually, we live in a deceptively connected world. We're actually more divided than ever, and it's mostly because of the way artificial intelligence works. So Facebook runs artificial intelligence that shows you what you want to see. And that builds inherent confirmation bias. And so the more you consume Facebook, the more you consume Instagram, you're actually just sort of seeing the same opinion over and over and over again. So it seems like it gives you an impression that you're having a discussion. But in reality, what's happening is the world is getting more divided. And you see, you know, the news, the big news these last 2 years has been fake news, but it's not actually fake news. It's biased news. And all you're seeing is one side of the opinion. So I think in many ways, as technologists, actually, we play a part in sort of creating this polarizing, isolated environment that we're entering in. And I mean, obviously, frankly, for us, it's, yes, fundraising is getting very hard. I think we're lucky in the fact that we closed recently with Alibaba and Nanfeng and a couple of different funds here in Hong Kong that is have been very supportive, I think, of the ecosystem. But at the same time, things have been slow. For a round that usually would take maybe 3 to 4 months, now it might take 8 to 9 months. And that projection moving forwards is even slower. People are saying that normally you build a 24-month runway, now you have to build 50 months and above in anticipation that sort of the cash is going to dry up. And it's already starting to dry up in Silicon Valley. And soon in Asia, I think it will as well. And that's all reflected based on a lot of things that are happening in the capital markets.
All right. I wanted to kind of make it a little more fun now. And you wanted to do a bit more of a demonstration about what exactly you're developing, which is this revolution that you're starting with no screens, which I'm still trying to wrap that around my head.
Yeah, so I see a couple of familiar faces here today. So for those of you guys that don't know, we're a little company based out of here in Hong Kong, and we make voice assistant products. So we're definitely more on the consumer side. We create a little smart ring that I'm wearing right now. This is our first product, but allows us to interact with our world in a screen-free way. So we made this product for my dad. My dad is visually impaired since he was 13 years old. And so we wanted to create a way where we can interface with smartphones and digital devices purely through voice in a private way. So the ring sends sound as a vibration that passes through your finger into your head that only you can hear, picks up your voice with a Ray microphone on the ring, and then is connected with the internet world, voice assistants. So you can do anything from like take a call, read out a message, ask the questions, triage your schedule, basically everything you do on your smartphone through this little ring. So simply put, let's say I was like taking a call or something, then I wanted to like do like a little party trick. I just like touch my finger to Sunny's ear like this, and then he would be able to hear something like that. But it's got a lot of sort of, and as we're moving forwards, I would say we're in the business of what we call bridging the mind and the machine. So we are moving forwards. We're trying to build basically the world's first bionic computer, and one that allows us to connect with the digital world 24/7 all the time, but in a more human, voice-based, conversational-based way. So machines become more human, and humans sort of connected more to machines, and we call that the convergence.
Wow. It's like very Inspector Gadget, as we were talking about. Just, when do you think this could be very mainstream, though? I mean, this type of technology.
Yeah, well, right now we're just sold out. It's mostly manufacturing. Mostly the demand right now is far outstripping our capability to manufacture the product. Our main market right now is mostly with SoftBank in Japan, and that's why you see less of the product here in Hong Kong. And we only have enough capital to hit one market at a time. And basically, SoftBank is eating up all of our inventory currently. But I think in the next couple of months, we actually plan, and this is sort of like secret news to the guys here, we actually plan on phasing out this product soon, in the next 4 to 5 months, because we have something, we're creating a product that actually will destroy our original product. Yes. Yes.
Wow. Can't wait to hear about that. Sunny, I mean, so much talk about tech these days. How do you feel about the sector at the moment? We hear stories like what Kevin has shared. Talk about valuations are getting a little bit too lofty. A lot of positioning into the tech space this year, regulatory risk, as you mentioned. Do you expect that to continue to drive markets next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do. First of all, I understand why all the smart kids want to do what Kevin's doing versus what I'm doing. But you know, I think it's going to be a difficult time for tech. But I think it's also not tech in general, but I think the overall headwinds are going to start to emerge in the coming few years. It might take longer or a little bit less time, but depending on how things evolve, regulators tend not to really regulate at the right level. When they tend to regulate, they tend to over-regulate first, especially if they don't understand it. And that's probably one of the bigger headwinds, but at the same time, I think it's inevitable that tech will become huge. The potential is there. It's going to happen. It's just how does it happen? There are going to be bumps along the way. From a valuation standpoint, what people haven't really been potentially putting into their forecasts is some of this regulatory headwind that's likely to come. And I think it's also about a winner-takes-all model within tech that tends to emerge. And that's going to continue, which means that active management within security selection is becoming extremely important, because if you're holding a passive basket of stocks, we all remember Kodak as a company, and we all remember what happened there. So if all of this disruption is coming, I think it bodes well for investors to become a little bit more active, even though we've been in a passive world for a long time, to think about putting your money with some professionals who can kind of differentiate between the winners and losers.
Michelle, maybe jump in a little bit about how technology has helped your line of work as well. I mean, obviously we talk about food security. It's a huge topic here in Hong Kong. How is that changing you're seeing here in the city? I mean, talk about Hong Kong. More than 90% of our food is imported, mainly from China. How does that impact food security overall here?
Yep. So it's been a very interesting conversation actually so far, and I feel like, you know, sometimes tech and the whole idea of farming could seem to be very much at odds. So just by way of a short introduction, so I think what we do is we are a social enterprise, and we want to bring urban farming, organic farming into the city. So I kind of like this spot where I'm sitting right now, because here I can see the building where we have a project, like just behind you on your right, where we have a rooftop farm that's growing organic vegetables, which will be donated to a food bank. So simply by, you know, the stats that Yvonne has brought up, so we import more than 98% of the food that we consume on a daily basis. So that actually makes us very vulnerable. So the whole idea is, is self-sufficiency even an option? I think at the moment, if we are realistic about it, it is definitely very in a distant future. But I think the disruption that we are looking at is that even while we're living in a city like Hong Kong, we are living in a very dense built-up environment. What are the opportunities we can identify? And this is where we can see the opportunities in spaces, like urban spaces, like rooftops, in the tops of buildings, commercial buildings that you work in. And these are actually all potential spaces where we can start growing our own food and getting more people to be engaged in the process of growing their own food. So in terms of technology, I think we are trying to also be a little bit cautious about the application, because on one hand, technology definitely would be able to increase our food supply. The way we grow it, we could grow it in vertical farms, we could grow it somewhere in a building, in a room somewhere. But the whole idea is that while we have the supply, while we have a lot of very innovative companies working on boosting the supply, but on the other hand, we also need to address the consumer intent. So people like you and I, right? So where we are more and more conscious and being a bit more aware of how the food is grown, and then we can avoid more food waste and therefore avoid the whole sort of scarcity that we are, that we're currently facing at the moment.
All right, I forgot to even mention the polling. Sorry about that. If you guys want to bring up the first question, I just want to bring, but we're let's do this one. The biggest threat to the global economy. That's going to be a very interesting one. If you could just kind of chime in. Trade tensions, political upheaval, or climate change. And while you guys vote, I'm going to just do a quick little game. It's just going to be kind of an A or B scenario. I'm going to go to each and one of you where you get to choose either 1 or 2 and what you're going to see next year. So I'm going to start with you, Kevin. What's going to be the big wearable to watch? Is it after the watch? Is it going to be glasses or rings?
It's not glasses or rings. It's something that we're making.
You can't leave it at that. You can't tell us what it is.
You can. We have 2 offices, one in MIT and one in. Feel free to swing by. And then
All right. Okay. How about this, Sunny? Stocks or bonds next year?
Multi-asset funds, but
You got to pick one. That's not the point of the game. Is to pick one.
I think we're actually pretty balanced across both now. We're moving more towards bonds, though, I'd say, as a tilt at the moment.
Oh, really? Okay. EM or DM?
Mostly DM for now, but we think there's a big opportunity for EM probably in the back half of next year.
Okay. Michelle, who can we point the finger to when it comes to climate change? Is it humans or something else?
I think definitely I would say we all play a role, humans, for sure. It's because we have the buying power. And, when it comes to food, the kind of choices we make, whether or not we eat too much beef or meat, that actually impacts, and the choices would also influence the way companies will produce the supply. So,
Can we bring up that poll for the biggest threat to the economy? I just want to see what the results were. I think it was politics was the biggest one. Political upheaval, I think. Professor, yep, there we go. Political upheaval, 61%. Brings me to my question, Professor Hu. Who comes out on top, President Xi or President Trump?
Both. Actually, both of them are facing hard decisions. In the end of this month, they're going to meet. What kind of deal they're going to make? This will have a huge impact for next year. This deal will be just for temporary halt for this trade war, or is a more relatively longer-term solution for the trade balancing issues between the 2 countries and a geopolitical game for the 2 countries. That's a big question they have to answer. Now, supposed to be this is a relatively good deal. I think we should be optimistic for the next year, at least until 2020. 2020 is the election year. I'm not very optimistic about things in 2020. So 2019, probably the market will have some good news coming out from the U.S. trade wrangling, but this is still a lot of uncertainty. Really depends on the 2 leaders.
And Pascal, I'll leave the last question to you. What are people going to be spending most on? Do I buy a car or do I buy an apartment?
Car or apartment? Well, I'm going to say it depends if you're in tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. I think in tier 1, apartments are becoming unaffordable, so maybe cars. And in tier 2, tier 3, you probably have still a chance to buy your house with a reasonable price. So that's what I would say.
All right. We're going to leave it at that. But thank you so much to our panelists. Before you guys go, I want to bring in Marcus. He's going to come on stage here. I think we have some Q&A sessions, or at least anyone that has a question for our panelists. Feel free to raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone around. Does anyone have a question? All right, over there.
Hi. There's some talk today. I mean, you talked about there's been a lot of talk about the politics, and it's right now it's kind of been framed as a Xi versus Trump situation. But I mean, from what you're looking at in terms of this populism, this kind of tension between China and the U.S. has been kind of brewing in the U.S. It's just that no politician has kind of come out and said and pinpointed China as the strategic rival. Now, my gut feeling is that whether Trump gets reelected or not, I think that's not really going to change, because if you look at the midterms, it seems like the one consensus among voters is China is the enemy, right? So the next politician, I don't think, is necessarily going to change course. Now, under that circumstance, we are moving into a Cold War. It's going to be potentially a 10, 20, 30-year thing. How does that change everybody's outlook? I mean, I guess for Pascal, does the consumer-driven market in China, is that enough to sustain it when it's a divided world? For Kevin, I mean, it's going to be two separate tech ecosystems maybe for the next 20 years. You know, and obviously for Professor, I mean, how do you see that unfolding? Is it going to be, is this the start of something that's 20 years long?
Can I?
Go for it.
Very quick, just a few points. First, there is a growing consensus in U.S. between Republican and Democrats, and it's actually among all the elite. China is a geopolitical rival, is an enemy down the road. But the next question is how to deal with this, geopolitical rivalry. And there's one end you see completely decoupling with China, so disengagement. There's no economic or whatever linkage with China. There's decoupling, and this is one extreme. But most people don't agree decoupling is the answer. So I would say on some areas there will be some disengagement and decoupling between U.S. and China, especially in high-tech area and then the military technology, blah blah blah. But in the fundamental economic relations cannot be decoupling. It's too costly. And the other thing is U.S., you have a political cycle every 4 years, 2 years, midterm election. China have a longer cycle. So this two cycle does not synchronize. And then I think China is waiting for a change on the U.S. side. I think next year Trump is going to reshuffle his administration again. We'll see some new variables and new changes.
Over there, yeah.
There's a question for Pascal. So I spent most of my life in the States, and then I've come here. So my consumption choices have shifted a bit. One thing I have noticed is that there are very few sort of Chinese names that American people buy, but there's a lot of American names that Chinese people buy. I mean, Apple's one of them. So I guess my question is, what are the sort of stumbling blocks for American consumers to buy more things made by Chinese companies? A really good example for me is movies. Like in the top 10 movies in China, a lot of them are American movies, but in the States, all the top 10 movies are Hollywood movies still, even though the Chinese government's spending lots of money on these movies made in China for Chinese audiences. Does that question kind of make sense?
Yeah, I think if you look at the trend in the box office in China, you see a lot more Chinese movies lately. And when you see the top grossing American movies, I can name, there was something about a gigantic shark recently. And
The Meg.
And another one about, very rich Asian families. I mean, you see that the central characters of major US productions are Chinese celebrities or Chinese stars. So, when that happens, I don't know whether it's an American product or a Chinese product, but clearly the influence of China is becoming more and more important globally. And again, going back to the box office in China, it's a lot of Chinese movies. Huh? I think the US movies have lost share in recent years.
To add to that, I think the baton for innovation also has to be fully handed over here as well. So it's not enough for arbitrage. It's not enough just to replicate the same quality. I think it's really about building new compelling experiences, building new products that can't be found in the U.S. And I think once Asian companies are able to grab a stronger grasp of that, then regardless of where the product is made, it will sell well.
One remark I could add to this is what's intriguing is you still don't have a lot of products that are Chinese branded. If you take the world of luxury, for example, luxury is still dominated by European and US brands. And I don't think we have seen very major examples of Japanese luxury brands. There are a few, but at a smaller scale. I don't think we have seen major Chinese luxury brands. And I think there was a remark made by President Xi Jinping about the power of Western economies to generate brand value. So this whole notion of brand value is still something that Western entrepreneurs master pretty well. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future, because when you look at the number of Chinese students in art schools, the number of Chinese students going into schools, fashion schools and so on, who are now into the creative teams of global brands, you can imagine that 5-10 years down the road, there will be some very powerful Chinese global brands.
I think we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much, everyone, for coming here today.